With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yoma Daf Gimel. We learned in the Mishnah that 7 days before Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol, who was the only one who does the Avodah on Yom Kippur, was sequestered from his home, and he spent the week in a chamber called Lishkas Parhedrin. The Gemara began quoting from a Mishnah in Para that a similar Prisha, a similar sequestration was made to the Kohen who was designated to shecht, to slaughter, and to burn, in other words, to do the avodah with the para aduma. And the question that was asked on Daf Beis Amud Aleph is, what's the source of these two halachas? So we began the sugya by saying that Rav Manyume, in the name of Rav Machasya, in the name of Rabbi Yechna, quotes a pasuk in Parshas Tzav. In Parshas Tzav, towards the end of the parsha, the Torah described that which happened to Aaron HaKohen prior to the 8th day in which Aaron for the first time served in the Mishkan. So there is what we call the Shivas Yemei HaMeluyim, and then you have Vayhi B'Yom HaShmini. And the Torah tells us that amongst other things that was done with Aaron prior to the 8th day, prior to his day of inauguration, was that Aaron was sequestered from his family. He also was not allowed to leave the Oyel Moed. And when the Torah at the end of Tzav speaks about this, recaps this event, the Torah says like this, that Kasher Asa B'Yom Hazeh, just like it was done to Aaron on this day, Tziva Hashem Lasois L'chaper Aleichem. God is commanding to atone for you. So says Rabbi Yechanan that lasois lachaper is referring to these two dinim that we are learning about, right? Lasois, the word lasois is referring to the para aduma, that you can't say it's coming lachaper, it's more coming lataher. Lachaper is speaking about Yom Kippur, just like there was a 7-day perisha prior to the Vayhi B'Yom HaShmini. Similarly, every year there has to be the halacha that we learned about in the beginning of the Masechta, the Shivas Yomim, that the Kohen Gadol is sequestered from his home in the Lishkas Parhedrin. Question is that Lachaper isn't only Yom Kippur. I know that Yom Kippur is called the Day of Atonement, but on other Yomim Tovim, Karbanos are brought Lachaper. So that is where we left off. How do you know that it doesn't mean that there has to be a sequestration 7 days before Pesach? How do you know that it doesn't mean that there has to be the Shivas Yimei Perisha prior to Sukkos? How do you know that it doesn't mean that's the last thing that we spoke about 7 days prior to Shmini Atzeres? So for the last question, the Gemara said, I'll tell you why. Because Shmini Atzeres has 7 days prior to it, that is Kodesh. The Yom HaShmini, for which that is the source law, didn't have 7 days of Yom Tiv. So therefore it cannot be teaching for Shmini Atzeres. It's more similar to Yom Kippur that does not have 7 days of Yom Tiv prior to it. That is where we left off. Now what we're going to have in today's daf is finalizing this discussion, because what we have to clarify is Atzeres, Shavuos, does not have 7 days of Yom Tov prior to it. Rosh Hashanah does not have 7 days of Yom Tov prior to it. So that's where we have to show that it's more compatible to use the Lachaper for Yom Kippur, and why and not for Atzeres and not for Rosh Hashanah. There's going to be various approaches. Actually, we're going to learn on Daf Gimel Amud Beis that when we began the sugya quoting Rabbi Yechanan, that was only really Rabbi Yechanan's repeating what he learned from Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yechanan himself has very similar limud, but it's not going to be exactly the way we learned it. But it's going to still come down to that it's learned from the Vayhi B'Yom HaShmini. That's going to be what we will call the approach of Rabbi Yechanan. And what we will introduce new today is the Shita of Reish Lakish that learns the concept of Prisha from the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu was inside a cloud on top of Har Sinai for 6 days prior to him entering the Machna Shechina, the Shamayim, the heaven, however we are to understand it. Now that's going to be fascinating, because that's really going to lead us into that we're going to learn on Daf Dalid, the whole sugi again that we had in Shabbos as to what day of the month was the Torah given, Everyone holds that the Torah was given on Shabbos. That means that Hashem revealed himself to all the Jewish people, right? And we experienced that Aseres HaDibros on Shabbos. The question is, was it the 6th day of the month or was it the 7th day of the month? And that's going to be intimately related to when are these 6 days that the Torah says that Moshe was in the cloud, or the cloud surrounded it for 6 days. It the mountain, it Moshe. Hashem called out to Moshe on the 7th day. When did that happen? Did that happen prior to us hearing that Aseres HaDibros? Or as Reish Lakish is going to be learning, as we're going to quote right now, that after we got the Aseres HaDibros from Hashem, after the Aseres HaDibros, really part of the 40 days, Moshe Rabbeinu was on top of the mountain, and he was surrounded by a cloud. And the reason why he was surrounded by a cloud is because you need to have, so to say, an additional preparation to enter the Shamayim, to enter the heavens, to enter the Machne Shechina. I know it's 6 and here it's 7, but that's the concept from where we see that it's not be'ikid about Perisha, like we learned in Rashi in the Mishnah, for him not to become Tamei, which is Rabbi Yechanan. No, it's about you are about to enter the Kodesh HaKadoshim. We're speaking now about the Kohen Gadol. On Yom Kippur, prior to entering the Kodesh HaKadoshim, you have to have this extra preparation, which is connected to being sequestered, to being separated from Olam Hazeh, in order to be readied to enter a whole different domain. Gavaldik. Now the beginning is going to have to work out. Well, by Moshe Rabbeinu was clearly only 6 days. The Mishnah says Shivas Yomim, like we spoke out in the Tosfos. The Perek begins with the number. All that and much more, Chevra, will be learned together today. Let us start on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph. We left off towards the end of the 4th line of the top of the Amid. Again, we are using the Shita of Rabbi Yechanan that uses the words Lachaper Aleichem in the Pasek and Sav to be referring to Yom Kippur and Frek the Gemara Ve'ei Matzeres. And the answers that we gave before won't work over here. Why? As the Gemara points out, right? What was the issue? How did we explain why the Lachaper cannot be referring to Shmini Atzeres? Because prior to Shmini Atzeres, there are 7 days of Yom Tiv. So that won't be similar to the Vayim Yom HaShmini. But here, if it's going to be referring to Atzeres, the Prisha, Shiva, it's going to fit. That we should say that there has to be a 7-day Prisha before Atzeres. Shavuos is only 1 day. And prior to the 1 day, there's no Kodesh. So it's mamish like the Vayim Yom HaShmini. Why are we applying it to Yom HaKippurim? Answers the Gemara, Amar Rebbe Abba, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Malachenu Shakolim Dvari. That done in Par Echad V'Ayel Echad. Let's speak a little bit about Karbanos. On Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol brought 1 bull and 1 ram. And that is similar. The avodah of the karbanis is similar to that which Aharon HaKohen brought on the 8th day, which was also Par Echad V'Ayel Echad. So they are more similar, La'afuke, and that will exclude Shavuos, that we dafka bring Shnei Elim Ninhu, that we bring 2 rams. And as we all are familiar with, just like the Korban Omer is brought on the 2nd day of Pesach, the 16th day of Nisan, no matter what day of the week it is, Korban Omer. Similarly, we have from the new wheat that grows in the Holy Land, we bring a korban that's called Shtei HaLechem on Shavuos, but really the Shtei HaLechem itself is not offered on the Mizbeach. All of those 2 loaves of Chametz Dika bread are divided amongst the Kehanim, but they are connected to 2 Elim, 1 loaf per 1 aisle. They are waved together. Shtei HaLechem means that it has to be Shnei Elim. So the avoid of the korbanos is dissimilar, so therefore it's more compatible, and indeed it becomes a melamed Yom HaShmini to a student that's more compatible, which is Yom HaKippurim. The problem is, now again, have a big part of Masechtas Yoma will be about the avoid of the korbanos. The question is like this, that on Yom Kippur, it's not clear when you look inside the Chumash as to how many korbanos were brought. And indeed, it's amazing that there is a machlokes Tanoim. Can you imagine? A machlokes Tanoim as to how many rams, how many elim. A ram is a male shepsela, that it's an adult. An adult means not within the 1st year, not like Psachim. And Bachlal, as a rule, no korban was brought in its 13th month. It's like the adolescent month. Nishgut, you're not a minor, you're not an adult. You become an ayol when you enter your 14th month on. Says the Gemara, that indeed on Yom Kippur, there was only one ayil brought, that makes it more similar to the Malamed, to the day of the inauguration. But according to the Mandamar, which is a Tana, that on Yom Kippur itself, Shnei Einim Ninu, which makes the avodah of the carbon of the ayil, Mamish, Yom Kippur, similar to Atzeres. So now we're back to our question. So maybe the Lachaper is coming to teach you the din of Shivas Yomim prior to Atzeres. And where do we have this machlokes? Did Tanya according to Braisa. Now my friends, just to halt a little bit cup over here, like this. To remember, in Parshas Pinchas, the Torah, beginning with B'chodesh Harishin, the Seder in Parshas Pinchas begins with the first month, which is Pesach. Pesach is the first yontiv mentioned here, and the parsha goes through the special musaf karbonis that are brought on each and every yontiv. And indeed, in Parshas Pinchas, when the Torah is speaking about B'chodesh Hashvi, when the Torah is speaking about the day of Yom Kippur, the Torah says that one bull, one par, one ayil is brought for musaf. One par, one ayil. No debate about that, but that's part of the musaf. The musaf is like a communal carbon that's brought on every Yom Tov. However, if you go back to Parshas Achrei Mois, so they were talking about Vayikra Perek Tezayin. In Pasuk 5 and Pasuk Hey, the Torah speaks about how from the community is brought one ram and a goat, lachatos. One ram, and two goats. And two he-goats for a chatos. That's the avodah of Yom Kippur. One ram. But that's when the Torah is speaking about what the community brings. Now the pasuk, two psukim prior, not in pasuk 5, but in pasuk 3, the Torah says that the Kohen Gadol brings one bull for a chatos and one ram to an oila. So there are two psukim, almost one back to back. Both of them are speaking about one ayil oila. However, the first pasuk speaks about the Kohen Gadol bringing the one ram. Two psukim later, we speak about the community. When the psukim speak about the two he-goats, there we also mention about a one ram. So there's a machlokes whether that was the same ram. It's very simple. If it's two different, if there's an avodah that's coming from the community versus a carbon that's coming out of the packet from the Kohen Gadol, then there are two different rams. And that's the machlokes. L'tanya Rebbe Omer ayil echad, that really one ayil is brought. We're not speaking about Musaf, we're not speaking about Parshas Pinchas, but we're speaking about the two psukim that we mentioned. No, we're speaking dafke, I'm sorry, I take that back. We're speaking about the ayil that's mentioned in Pinchas, and the ayil that's mentioned in Pasuk 5 and Achrei Mois, both speaking about the community. That was one. Ha'amur kan, the one that's mentioned here in Achrei Mois, that's Perek Tezayin, Pasuk 5, is the same ayil, because Musaf is also communal karbanis. Ha'amur b'parshas ha'pikudim. And indeed, according to Shitas Rebbe, the answer we gave is a Gavaldika answer. That means on Shavuos, the community brought two elim with the Shtei Alechem. On Yom Kippur, we brought one ayil. So that makes it similar to the Vahi B'Yom HaShmini. But Rabbi Lazar b'Rab Shimon Omer, no, Shnei Elamim. Echad ha'amur kan, the one that's mentioned in Achrei is one ayil. And then there's another ayil, the one that's connected to Musaf. Ha'amur b'Parshas ha'pikudim. So now there's two elim. Answers the Gemara, and now guys, we're going to come to Pasuk Gimel in a moment. But now we're focusing on the Musaf in Parshas Pinchas and Pasuk Hey in Parshas Achrei Mois. Answers the Gemara, Afilu Temer Rab Lazar b'Rab Shimon, even according to this Tana, still Yoma Kippurim. True that there were two elim, but they're very different. Chad l'choivas hayoim. Parshas Achrei Mois is speaking about that which Yom Kippur has to bring uniquely because it's Yom Kippur. Now I know that Musaf in Parshas Pinchas is also the Musaf of Yom Kippur, but Musaf is something as a carbon that's brought on every Shabbos and Yom Tiv. So we're going to separate them. The Chad, the one in Pinchas, is only Musafim. So if you want to ask the avodah of Yom Kippur, how many karbanis and ayil from the community, how many were there? Even according to Rab Lazar b'Rab Shimon, there was one. La Fukiyat Seres, Ditarvayu, Choivas, Hayoim, Ninhu. As we mentioned, these two elim were that which came along with the Shtei Halechem. They were connected to each other. So still, Yom Kippur is more similar to Vayehi B'Yom Hashmini. Frek the Gemara, now again we're going to come back, we're not done yet with this pasuk, Gimel and Achrei Mois. Says the Gemara, Vayikar Rosh Hashanah, Ay Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is also biblically only one day. Prior to Rosh Hashanah, you don't have 7 days of Kodesh. The Prisha Shiva only L'Yom Echad. So maybe the Lachapit and Sav is referring to Rosh Hashanah. 3 lines before the bottom says the Gemara, Amar Abba Bohu, that Donin Par Va'ayil Shaloi, Mipar Va'ayil Shaloi, both the par and the ayil that is brought on Yom Kippur, it came out of the pocket. The Kohen Gadol himself paid for it, which is unique. When else did we have that? That the korban that was brought on Vayehi B'Yom Hashmini was also out of the pocket of Aaron HaKohen. Mipar Va'ayil Shaloi, which makes them more similar. Lafuke Yatzeres. And Rosh Hashanah, now the answer is not only going to fanem for Rosh Hashanah, is going to fanem for Yatzeres also. It's going to answer everything. That there were korbanos that were brought. However, they were from the communal pocket. So now the Gemara is introducing a Psanai Yezach. That what? That on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol, and this is now we are referring to Perek Tez Zayin, Pasuk Gimel, the Torah says clearly that he brings his, it means that is out of his pocket. And here again, the Gemara is going to say, hold on, how do you know that? This only is correct according to the opinion that says that when the Torah uses the words Kach Lecha, right? And the words Kach Lecha are words that we find regarding the Meluyim. Kach Lecha Ego, that means Mishalcha, out of pocket. Okay? This pasuk is a pasuk in Parsha Shmini. Just to read the whole pasuk, it says that Vayomer el Aaron Kach Lecha Egel ben Chatas ben Barka Lachatas Va'ayil Oilo Tmimim. So, which means that Moshe is telling Aaron, take not only for yourself but from yourself. Similarly, turning to Dav Gimel Amud Beis, Va'asei Lecha. We're going me'inyan le'inyan. Va'asei Lecha is that which we find in Parshas Baha'al Loischa. After the Torah told us how we would camp, how we would travel, then the Torah introduces how did Moshe Rabbeinu notify everyone that it's time to move on. So we have the special mitzvah of Asei Lecha Shtei Chatzoitzroitz, or the Alter Rebbe says Shtei Chatzitzurois of Kesef, that he made the 2 trumpets. And there again the parsha begins with the words Asei Lecha. So there is a Manda Amar that interprets that Asei Lecha doesn't only mean that it should only be used by Moshe. It's being made for you. It should be made from your funds. Mishalcha. And then it's going to fit that that you have in the pasuk that we mentioned, pasuk Gimel, Tezayin Gimel, is to be understood that Aaron brought the par va'ayil from his own pocket. The pasuk that we have, Vayehi B'Yom Hashmini, is that the korban is being brought out of Aaron HaKohen's pocket. So they are taka similar, and that will taka separate both Rosh Hashanah and Atzeres. But there is another opinion that holds that Mishal Tzibur means both the karbanos that we read about on Parsha Shmini, even though the lashon pasuk is Vayemer el Aaron Kach Lecha Egel, doesn't mean take out of your pocket. It means that is going to be brought for you. Asei Lecha means that the chatzotros are being made only for Moshe. It was never used after Moshe, these chatzotros. Fine. But it was not out of pocket. So we're back to the question, Ma'ikal Meimar. And the Tanya, where do we have this two? Where do we find these 2 opinions? So now we're quoting the pasuk in Parshas Kisisa. We're introducing yet something else. What do we have in Parshas Kisisa? That the Torah commands us to make the Ketoides, a little more of Ketoides. And how does the Parsha of the Ketoides begin? Kach Lecha Samim. So what does it mean? Kach Lecha Samim says this Tana, Mishalcha, that the funds to buy those Samim that we just learned about in Masechta Shkalim, right? I take that back. In Shkalim we learned about the Sheman HaMishchan. But the Ketoides we learned about where, Chevre? Let's remember, I think also in Shkalim. In any event, the Ketoides was brought out of pocket from Moshe Rabbeinu. Likewise, when it says Va'asei Lecha is what we just quoted, right? The Va'asei Lecha, Shtei Chatzoitzroitz Kesef Parshas Ba'al Loischa means Mishalcha. And in contrast, whenever it says V'yikhu Eilecha, where do we have V'yikhu Eilecha? We know from the Maimon of Atat Tetzav, right? V'yikchoi lecha taka, it should be taken to Moshe Rabbeinu, but it doesn't say kach lecha because taka there, it means that the Yidden should bring to Moshe Rabbeinu. Like the Pshat is, like the Hasidus is, that's the Tana. That's why it's not consistent. Sometimes it says kach lecha, sometimes it says v'yikchoi lecha. So again, according to that, then the words that are used both by the Maluyim and by Yom Kippur make them distinct. Meaning that Aaron HaKoyen by the Shivas Yemei HaMaluyim and the Kohen Gadol forever has to buy their own part of ayil. And these are only this is the opinion of Rabbi Yoshe. But Rabbi Yonasan Oima, no. Bein kach lecha, bein v'yikchoi lecha, even though they are worded different, they both mean mishal tzibur. This all comes back to the question. Yoma tamad loimer kach lecha. Why doesn't it say v'yikchoi lecha? This is going back, for example, by the Ketores. So the answer is, explains Rabbi Yonasan, that kaviyachol, it is as if that Hashem is telling Moshe Rabbeinu, Mishalcha ani roitze, yoser mishalahem. God says, listen, the funds for the Ketores has to be communal funds. It comes from the Shkolim, which is participated with every single meal. However, I would have preferred for it to come to you. And Ochalpi Chasidus, the whole vart, that normally 10 is the number of Kedusha. Normally 11 is the number of Klippa. And in the Ketores, from the 11 types of roots, we have the Chelbana. Right? And the Chelbana, according to one sheet and Kabbalah, is the 11th ingredient. The Chelbana has a terrible odor. Elamah, when you mix the Chelbana together with all the other 11, it became sweetened. In other words, that the Ketores represents the koyach to transform something that stinks into something that smells amazing. And who has that koyach? Who has the koyach to transform? That's the koyach of a tzaddik, that's the koyach of Moshe Rabbeinu. It's connected. So Hashem says, I would have wanted it to come from you. And let's go weiter. Abba Chanan Amar, in the name of Rabbi Lazar, going further on this topic, and that also goes back to a sugya that we have in Shkolim, that cause of Echad Oimer, it says in one pasuk, and we're quoting in our pasuk in Parshas Ekev, specifically connected to the second Luchais, where Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, V'asisa lecha aroin eitz, and let's go again with lecha. If asisa lecha doesn't only mean to make for you, but it means to make from your funds, that lechaira would mean that who paid for the aroin eitz? Moshe Rabbeinu. The cause of Echad Oimer, and now we're going back to Parshas Truma, says, Va'asu aroin atzei shitim. They shall make. Clear, the Lashon is not the same. And ha'keitzad. How does it be? No, it's who paid for the ark. Now, Chevra, we just learned Shkolim, and we just learned the Shita that says that there were two aroinos. And l'chu'ura, if you follow the Shita that there were two aroinos, that would be the simple go-to answer. There were two aroinos. The aroin eitz, that was made, like we explained when we learned Shkolim, prior to the building of the Mishkan, that was made, you can taich out of Moshe Rabbeinu's pocket. The Aron that the Torah is speaking about on Parshas Betzalel, the golden Aron, that was actually made through, the one in charge was Betzalel, that was made out of the communal funds. That would be one way of answering it. So first of all, there's a machlekes in Shkolim, whether there were two Aronis, whether there was one Aron. Even though the way we learned the Gemara in Shkolim is L'kula Alma, there were two Aronis. But the better approach that the Achreinim speak about over here is that even though there were two arks, the Gemara or the Braisa is based on the premise that they were paid for the same way. There could have been two arks, but it doesn't make sense that the funds for them should be so different. Based on that premise, the same concept of that even when Hashem says, you make, it's Kaviyachal Hashem saying, I would have preferred for it to have come from you, but it actually means it came from the communal funds like all else. That can, when the Torah uses the words va'asu aroin shitim, they shall make. You know when Hashem taka wants for the funds of the Aron to come from all, which is only what happened according to the Shita, is bisman sheyisrael oitzim l'shoyin shalmakim. That when we are fulfilling Hashem's ratzin, alpi chasidus, when we are reached the level that we actually make a new ratzin in Hashem, this is the koyach of a tzaddik, right? Tzaddik goyzer HaKadosh Baruch Hu mekayim. When all the Yidden are on that level, then Hashem taka wants that the funds should be from all the Yidden. Kan, the pasuk in Ekev, and taka, that was after the Cheto Egel. And there are many levels of atonement, and we were not yet on the highest level. The highest level came dafka on Yom Kippur, correct? And the commandment in Ekev, when Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu that va'asiso l'cha roin eitz, that was before Yom Kippur. Forget, that's part of the pasuk of Hashem telling Moshe Rabbeinu, p'salacha shnei luchos. That was before he went up the third time. So that's Bizman She'en Yisrael Oitzim L'Shoyne Shalakayim. So it's Kaviyachal, as God says, listen, the money de facto came from all the Yidden. That's again these Tanoim. But it's Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, I would have preferred for the money only to come from you. Bottom line is that there is a Machlokes Tanoim, both regarding the Maluyim and regarding Yom Kippur, whether the Pshat over there in Tezayin Gimel is that it came out of his own pocket. Now, if it did not come out of his own pocket, so the answer goes away. So answers the Gemara, no. At Kanloi Pligi, yes, you quoted me a Braisa. And like we mentioned, the Braisa is referring to the Ketaitis. The Braisa is referring to the Chatzoitzres. The Braisa is not quoting the Pasuk in Ekev where it says, V'asiso l'cha. And Eina Chanami, that there is a machlokes what that means. Bekichas ba'alma and asiyas ba'alma. Takings, makings, right? The kichas the alma, for example, repeating. When it says kach l'chasamim, we take have a machlokes. When it says asiyas ba'alma, we're going now to Parshas Bahal Loischa Asay L'Chosh Teichatzoitzres Kesev. One Tana holds, actually here we had two Tanoim hold that it was not out of the personal pocket, it was out of a communal pocket. Avol Hanoch, but when it comes to both the Vayibayim Hashmini and to every year the Avoid of Yom Kippur, Parshas Achri Mois, it must be, says the Gemara, that it's almost as if Perushe Komefarshe, it's written clearly that those Karbanos Take came from out of pocket. Di Meshel Chahu. How is it so clear over there? So let's go on the Seder of both of the Chumash. Shmini is speaking about the inauguration, and Achri Mois is a bit later about Yom Kippur, and chronologically in time. B'Meluyim it says, and we're focusing on a pasuk in Parsha Shmini, which is Vayikra Tes pasuk Gimel. It says Ve'el Bnei Yisrael Tedaber Lemer, speak to the Yidden. K'chu Seir Izim Lachatos. Now, who is buying this Seir Izim Lachatos? It says Bnei Yisrael. It says in one pasuk prior, in Peirik Tes pasuk Beis, Vayomer El Aaron Kach Lecho Egel Ben Bakar Lachatos. No, here it's different. Here you have two psukim. Both psukim are speaking about bringing a chatos. They're mamish back to back. In one pasuk, the wording is speak to the Yidden to bring it. In the pasuk prior, it says tell Aaron to bring it. Why does Hashem change it? So it's not like we said before that even though it's Parshas Ekev, Parshas Truma, Kam Bizman Yisrael Oitzim Netzoinoi, there it's not so problematic. That's a good way of learning the Chumash. Even though the expressions are not consistent, but it's in two different areas. But when you have one pasuk adjacent to the other, Hashem's telling Bnei Yisrael to bring a chatas, Hashem telling Aaron, Kach L'cha, no, there it must mean that the chatas, the ayil and the chatas that was brought on the Meluyim was taka L'cha, meaning out of pocket. Shma Mina, Kach L'cha, Misha L'chahu. And that is something the Gemara is saying that no one debates. Similarly, when it comes to Yom Kippurim, Parshas Achrei Mois, Michti Ksiv, it says, this is Tez Zayin Pasik Gimel. That what? Bezois Yavai Aaron Al HaKodesh, Ben Bakar Lachatos. And then it says, only in two psukim later, you have another pasuk. Ume'ez Bnei Yisrael Yikach Shnei Seirei Izim Lachatos. That's what you have in pasuk 5. Then you have now in Tez Zayin Pasik 6. That vehikre v'sparachatas asher loy. The whole thing doesn't make sense. In other words, the Torah separates two psukim. One, right, pasuk gimel, that bezois yev Aaron la'kodesh with par ben bakar lachatos. Now, if that was the same one that's mentioned in pasuk 5, and in pasuk 5 it says explicitly ume'ez bnei Yisrael, he should bring the chatos, right? So it's clear. So the Torah mentioned the par lachatos, the Torah mentioned the shnei seirim lachatos, and the Torah says that he should enter. So the whole pasuk 6 is extra when it says v'hikr v'sparachatos asher loy. Is acharai? No. That's the Torah is making it very clear that there were two chatois over here. You have the two seirim lachatos that came from the communal funds, but then there was the chatos, right? The pad ben bakar lechatos that asher loy, which came out of his pocket. Shmamino hay loy mishaloyu. And that, well, again, that will farenfer why we are applying the lechaper dafke to Yom Kippurim, because it's the most similar to the Miluyim, both out of pocket, and we will not apply it not to Atzeres nor to Rosh Hashanah. Avashi Yomar, another answer why we are including Yom Kippur and excluding Rosh Hashanah and Atzeres. Omar donin par lechatos va'aya lo'oilo. We're speaking here about the avodah of Yom Kippur. Mi par lechatos va'aya lo'oilo the Miluyim la'afuke Rosh Hashanah. This is gavaldik. The Atzeres, that both of them were brought as oilas, right? Gavaldik. In other words, both the ram and the bull are brought oilas. So the carbon type, forget about out of whose pocket. The carbon types are more similar. Gavaldik. Ravina Amar, Ravina answers, Donen avoida b'koin gadol, which is exactly what needs to happen on Yom Kippur. Ma avoida b'koin gadol, which is what happened by Yom Hashmini. That avodah was performed dafka by Aharon and la'afuke kula kushiyasin. All of the challenges that we had right from the bottom of Daf Beis Amud Aleph. Why don't we include this yontif? Why don't we include that yontif? No, the answer is pashut, because who does the avodah on yontif? It doesn't have to be by the kohen gadol. The lav avodah b'kohen gadol ninu. That's one version of what Ravina answered, and ve'ikad amri, another version of what Ravina answered is Amar Ravina. Here are the words, done in avoida tchila. We learn an avoida that is called a first avoida, which is referring to every Yom Kippur. May avoida tchila, from the mother law, from the source law, which is the Miluyim, it's called a first avoida. La'afuke hani, that again will exclude all of the challenges that we had, not only today, Rosh Hashanah Atzeres, but what we had also in Daf Beis Amud Beis, the laf tchila nino. Now, what does that mean? The Gemara wants to clarify what's this ikad amri. My tchila, what do you mean by a first avoida? If it means that tchila b'koyin gadol, tchila b'koyin gadol means it's the first ever avoida that has to be done by a kohen gadol, well, then it's more or less, then the ikad amri is really not that different than the first version. It's just a semantic difference. Says the Gemara, no. Avoida tchila means b'makoim. B'makoim means that no one ever enters the Chodesh HaKodshim. Yom Kippur, it's once a year, but still, he's doing a avoida in a makoim that it's new. It was never done before. Gavaldik. And that is taka the most similar to what happened in the inauguration. What happened in the inauguration? Well, before the Mishkan, no one did any avodah anywhere like that. So that was a new location that, so to say, was sanctified during the Miluyim. Now, the new Makoim wasn't the Kodesh HaKodshim on the Miluyim. He was not allowed to enter on Rosh Chodesh Nisan into the Kodesh HaKodshim. Actually, one of the understandings of the sin of Nadav and Avihu was that they entered into the Kodesh HaKodshim. Fine, but we're speaking about even the Mizbeach HaChitzon the avodah was never done on the Mizbeach HaChitzon. It was a new location. That's the pshat. So something that's in a new location, Kodesh HaKodshim Yom Kippur, should be learned from something that's done on a new location on the Mizbeach HaChitzon. Ela avodah tchila b'makim, avodah tchila b'makim. Now here we got just a problem over here, and that is, hold on. How can the Gemara say that Aaron HaKohen on the 8th day, prior to which he had the 7-day sequestration, did an avodah on a brand new place, in a place where no avodah was done? What are you talking about? Shivas Yemei HaMiluyim, Moshe Rabbeinu did the avodah, all of the avodah for the whole 7 days. It wasn't new. So Rashi addresses that. So Rashi begins more or less 20 lines from the top of the Amid. It's almost in the middle of the Amid. We have time, so we'll learn the Rashi. Tchila b'makim, in the beginning of the line, what's b'makim? Yom HaKippurim. Yesh le'avodah l'fnai v'l'fnim. Sheb'yom HaKippurim harishon hoyse tchila b'makim. Shekodem l'chei lo nichnas ad musham la'avodah. He says even better, the first Yom Kippur, no one ever entered. And the Yom Shmini L'Miluyim was also considered an avodah that happened in its location for the very first time. Avodah tchila, on a Chodesh Nisan, you didn't go l'fnai v'l'fnim, but even the Mizbeach HaChitzon, the first time it was used was on the Vayeh Bayem Hashmini. Ayfrek Rashi v'im b'shvil sheshimei shmoishe kol shivas yemei hameluyim. This is a very important Rashi. Zogt Rashi, ein keruya avoida eitzel avoidas kohanim. That you cannot compare the avodah of Moshe Rabbeinu to the avodah of the kohanim. Why? Shahu belavush bigdei kahuna. Because when a kohen, any kohen, speaking about the Yom HaShmini, Mustaka Aaron HaKohen, they get dressed in the garb of kohanim. And the bigdei kahuna is part of that which makes the kohen a kohen. So there was a kohen. Vishel Moshe wore chaluk lavin. Moshe did not get dressed in the bigdei kahuna. How was he b'chlal allowed to do the avodah? So that was like a heter l'shah. Shalayuchshed el l'shah. But we have to remember this Rashi because we will have a sugya asking whether Moshe Rabbeinu had a status of a kohen or whether Moshe Rabbeinu never had a status of a kohen. And we're going to have those who opine that Moshe Rabbeinu did have a status of a kohen gadol. He wasn't just a Levi, he also was a kohen gadol, which means he really, once you are holy, Kedusha never leaves, he remained with that status. And there's going to be opinions that will hold that he was a kohen gadol super, to the point that he didn't even need the bigdei kahuna. And clearly, this Rashi does not subscribe to that. Means Rashi could have answered that it was the first time that the kohen gadol did the avodah. No, Rashi wants to emphasize that no kohen did. There was no real avodah on the mizbeach until the 8th day. It was the first time. Moshe Rabbeinu was Rasha. He was just training. That's a very big sugya that we'll have elsewhere. But coming back over here, so Chavra Atkan is how we learned the limud from Rabbi Yechanan. And again, all of this is based on a pasuk in Parshas Tzav. The pasuk writes again, Kasher Asa Bayoim Hazeh is Siva Hashem Lasois Lechaper Aleichem. And guys, remember Daf Beis. Lasois Paraduma. Lechaper, as we just went through, the most similar is Yom Kippur. 2 dinim from one pasuk. Who said that? Rav Menyumei, etc., in the name of Rabbi Yechanan. Now, says the Gemara, this is what they had all in Bavel. Mitamal kumta Rav Dimi. Rav Dimi moved or came, he visited from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, and he came with teachings of Rabbi Yechanan, and he had a whole new version. And he says that Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Masnichod. I want you to know that Rabbi Yechanan, from this pasuk, only learns one din. Not Lasois Paraduma. Lachaper is Yom Kippur. He used this pasuk to teach you one din. It was Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi that learned Tate. Now, which one din does Rabbi Yechanan learn? So Rabbi Dimi is sharing all this. Rabbi Yechanan masni chadam that both the word lasois and the word lachaper only goes to Yom Kippurim. Now, we're going to have 2 problems. Number one is, does it mean that our version of Rav Machasya, Rav Menyumei Bal Chilkiya, Amar Rav Machasya Baridi Amar Rabbi Yechanan, is that a corrupted version? That's one thing we have to clarify. And number 2, if Rav Dimi is correct, he's quoting Rabbi Yechanan, and Rabbi Yechanan learns from this pasuk only Yom Kippur, so now we're going to be back to the question, how does Rabbi Yechanan know what's Rabbi Yechanan's source to the Mishnah in Paraduma? That 7 days before the Kohen did the avodah of the Paraduma, he was also sequestered. If it's not learned from here, then where is it learned from? But let's go weiter. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is the one that learns Tarti, which is what we had before in the name of Rabbi Yechanan. That Lasois Elo Masa Para, Gevaldik, and Lachaper Elo Masa Yom Kippurim. So now we're learning the first medium-sized line. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yechanan Masni Chada. How can that be? For Anantanan, we learn Shivas Yom Karim Yom Kippurim and Shivas Yom Karim Seifas HaPara. We know Rabbi Yechanan doesn't argue with the Tana. Right? Tanoim affirm, no one even debates, that the din of Prisha, 7 days, isn't only a din for Yom Kippur, it's also a din for the Paraduma. Says the Gemara, and a Chanami. Rabbi Yechanan is not, the version of Rav Dimi is not that Rabbi Yechanan argues with the din. But the Yom Kippurim's Prisha is sourced in a pasuk. The Shivas Yomim before the Paraduma is not something biblical, and there's no source in a pasuk. It's only what we call Ma'aleh Ba'alma. Ma'aleh means a stringent standard, a higher bar, a higher standard that the Chachamim felt the rabbis were the ones that brought this about. And as we spoke out on Daf Beis, Dafka because Lahoitzi mi Liban shal Tzedukim, they made the Kohen doing the Avodah Tamei, and they took him to the mikvah, but he did the Avodah prior to head of Shemesh. So that can make someone feel you don't have to be that careful with Tum and Tara. So they needed to counterbalance it. And therefore they added unique ma'ala, stringencies. So that was a rabbinic stringency. Now, fragt the Gemara, okay, but didn't we quote, now we're quoting Daf Beis. But V'ha Amar Rav Ben Yomei, Bar Chilkiya, Amar Rav Machasya Bar Idi, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, that kasher asa b'yom hazeh tziva Hashem lasois lechaper aleichem, all in the name of Rabbi Yechanan. That lasois masapara, which sounds like Rabbi Shua ben Levi, lechaper elamaisa Yom Kippurim. So hello, what did Rabbi Yechanan say? Answers the Gemara that which we quoted on Amid Beis Amid Aleph is Rabbi Yechanan in the name of his teacher. And we'll see the teacher that we are referring to is the Tana Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yechanan himself rejected that. He held that lasois lechaper is only speaking about Yom Kippur. The Chiyasir Ravin Amar Rabbi Yechanan Mishum Rabbi Yishmael, that lasois elo masapara and lechaper elo ma'aseh Yom Kippurim, which is gavaldik. So here we see that that's only Shitas Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yechanan learned it from his teacher, sometimes quoted the teachings of his teacher, but he himself did not agree with that. Gavaldik. Now, so Atkan, with all of the nuances, we have one din. If someone is going to ask, from where do we know that you have to have Prisha 7 days? The answer we have so far generally is, we learned that din from the Meluyim. By the Meluyim, Aaron was, during the Shivas Yimei HaMeluyim, he needed to be sequestered in the Oyel Moed. Then he did the Avodah. That is the source that before the Kohen Gadol every year goes into the Kodesh Kachim, Shivas Yamim. Atkan Shitas Rabbi Yechanan. Now, Amalei Shlakish le Rabbi Yechanan. First of all, before I tell you from where I learned it from, I'm going to prove that your limud is erroneous. Because you are learning this din of sequestration from the Meluyim. There's a premise that one can challenge, but we'll leave that for later. And that premise is that every single detail that is mentioned regarding that which happened during the Shivas Yemei HaMeluyim, every detail isn't only ideal to do, but if you didn't do it, it's a b'diavad kosher. No. Every detail by the Meluyim is that important that if something was omitted, it invalidates the whole avodah. And if that is the source law, af hachinami, logic says if you learn it from there, so here should be similar to there. That kol hakasav behem should be ma'akev. And Rab Shlokish says, and you see that over here there is a step that is not being done, and which proves that you can't learn it from the Meluyim. Now, v'chi teima hachinami, hold on, who said that there is a step over here that if you skip it, it invalidates the avodah? Says Reish Lakish, I'll prove it to you. And this is a gavaldik point. So if you remember in the Mishnah, we had a machlokes tanoim whether you have to separate what will we call that? A prepared wife. Whether you have to have, just in case, God forbid, the Kohen Gadol's wife passes away, whether you have to have a backup wife. That was a machlokes tanoim. But everyone subscribes that you have to have a backup Kohen Gadol, because he might become tummy. Now, Tuma, like we mentioned, is something a lot easier to happen than someone passing away. But let me ask you a question, says Reish Lakish. What does the Kohen proper need to do? It says mafrishin. What does mafrishin mean? He needs to be sequestered away from his house in a location, quarantined in a location that lishkas parhedrin. What is the din regarding the backup Kohen Gadol? Does the backup Kohen Gadol have to be sequestered? You know what? The Mishnah not only didn't mention it, the Mishnah uses a different type of word, which Taka gives us to understand that the backup Kohen Gadol did not have to be sequestered. Which means, let me ask you, if Taka the Kohen Gadol became tummy, what happened? Oh, for that you have the backup Kohen Gadol. So then the backup Kohen Gadol went ahead and did the avodah. Problem is the backup Kohen Gadol did not sequester himself, did not have perisha. All of this is a raya that the mitzvah that we are learning about is not a ikuva mitzvah. It's not an essential step. It's not a step that if it didn't happen, you have no avodah. It's something that's ideal. Oh, when something is ideal, it makes more sense to say that here's the Kohen, guys, the Kohen Gadol should sequester himself. The backup Kohen Gadol probably won't be needed. And since b'di'eved, if he's needed, he doesn't even need the 7 days, so we don't bother him to be quarantined for 7 days. You see, we don't jump to quarantine people that quick. But all of that is a raya that this whole din of Perisha is not essential. Beautiful. Let's read it inside. V'hatana, no. V'chitei machinami, no. V'hatana, it says in our Mishnah, when it's umaskinen loy, that's the words. Umaskinen loy koyin acher, we prepare a backup koyin gadol. And the Mishnah doesn't say that the backup koyin gadol has to sequester himself. It doesn't say that. This is a gavaldik raya, which taka means that if it happened that the koyin gadol became tummy and you needed to use the backup koyin gadol, the backup koyin gadol would do the avodah without sequestration, without perisha. And the Shlakish tells his brother-in-law, don't tell me, but he did it. The Mishnah just doesn't mention it. That what does it mean? That maskinen, what does it mean? You prepare a secondary, a backup kohen gadol, mafrishin. Says Reish Lakish, no. No way that the same Mishnah, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, will not be consistent. Litanei oy idi ve'idi maskinen, oy idi ve'idi mafrishin. The Mishnah changes the expression. The backup kohen gadol was not sequestered. Now again, hopefully we never needed him. But if we needed him, he was good to go without Perisha. Gavaldik. Now, the amazing thing here is that Rabbi Yechanan now goes on the offensive. Rabbi Yechanan does not defend his position. And as we'll see in a moment, Rabbi Yechanan and Reish Lakish both agree that all of the steps mentioned in Sav and in Shmini, all of the steps that was done during the Shivas Yemei HaMeluim, during the inauguration, is essential. What Rabbi Yechanan disagrees with Reish Lakish is that even though the source law is the Meluim, the derivative law, right, the student, Perisha Yom Kippur, doesn't have to be the same. It must be that way. Because indeed, the backup, Kohen Gadol, did not have to go through Perisha. And Rabbi Yechanan does learn it from the Meluim. But Rabbi Yechanan doesn't go into that debate with Reish Lakish at all. He goes on the offensive. So Amalei, so Rabbi Yechanan tells Reish Lakish, okay, so I hear that you reject my source. So where do you know it from? If not from Eluyim, which is such an easy source because the pasuk says explicitly, just like now, same tool, lasos lachapet, it's referring to something. But you're rejecting, you're saying, it's not going to Yom Kippur. So Elamar mehecha yalaflo, where do you learn it from? And Gavaldik, so here's the second answer that we have. So Amar responds Reish Lakish that the source that I have for the Shivas Yomim of Perisha is from Sinai. Moshe Rabbeinu, guys, this is going to go into Daf Daled, beautiful. That after we all experienced the Gilui Elikus that happened during Matan Torah, after that Moshe Rabbeinu went up the mountain. And even though he went up on the mountain, as we'll see on the 7th day of Sivan, we have to say that because in order for him to break the luchas on the 17th, and there's 40 days, so he needed to go up from the 7th. If not, the cheshbon won't fit. But according to details in next daf, the first 6 days of the 40 days were not like the rest of the 40 days. However, you'll understand of Moshe Rabbeinu entering the heaven, pshat was that he went up the mountain. And it says, Vayichasehu he'anan. And we'll see a machloikis, whether the anan, the cloud covered it, whether it goes to the mountain, or no, Reish Lakish understands it covered Moshe. That Moshe Rabbeinu, as the final step that would make him worthy and able, or able and worthy, to enter the heavens, whatever that means, he needed to be sequestered. He needed to be quarantined. For how long? For 6 days. Now the obvious question will be, hold on, if the whole source is Sinai, then the Mishnah says Shivas Yomim, there it was 6 days. Doesn't matter. First the concept. Says Reish Lakish. The Chsiv as it says, and what's beautiful, Keyadua, that the event of Sinai is mentioned aside of what's mentioned in Mishnah Torah and V'eschanan. Aside of that, we have it mentioned in the Yisrael and in Mishpatim. And the Rebbe has a Gavaldik insight that the reason why, if you push it, read that which is recorded in the Torah prior to the Aseret Adibus in Yisrael. If you were to read the ending of Parshas Mishpatim, it's a different narrative. The reason why it was recorded twice with different nekudas is because the way the Rebbe explains that when Hashem gave us the Torah, there is what Hashem experienced when He gave us the Torah, and God recorded His experience, Kaviyachal, and then the greatness of Hashem is that we had our experience. And Hashem records in Parshas Mishpatim what we experienced. And it can be a whole different experience as it was, and that explains, that's the root of the explanation of all of the nuance of the differences. So we are quoting now Psukim in Parshas Mishpatim. What does it say? It says, Vayishkoin kavoid Hashem al Har Sinai. That the kavoid Hashem was resting on Har Sinai. Vayichaseyu he'onon sheishes yamim. Resh Lakish understands that Vayichaseyu is not on the mountain. As we'll learn again in the next daf, there's a whole other option, but not Resh Lakish. It covered Moshe. Moshe first needed to be completely swallowed up by the cloud for 6 days, and then Vayikra Moshe b'yom hashvi, God called out to Moshe. Now says Resh Lakish, beautiful, if the Torah would not have written 6 days, if the Torah would have written that the Kvoid Hashem was on Har Sinai, and the Torah would have says Vayichaseyu ha'anan without writing the word 6 days. Again, he understands Vayichaseyu ha'anan means that Moshe Rabbeinu was covered by the cloud, which means that he went up and he was in the cloud. Don't write 6 days. Write that he was covered with the cloud. Write that Hashem called out to Moshe on the 7th day. Well, if you would have had those words, you would have known if God called out to him on the 7th day, it means that he was quarantined, kaviyachal, inside the cloud for 6 days. The word 6 days is mamish superfluous. So sin, michti, behold, it says, Vayikra el Moshe b'yom hashvi. So my sheishes yamim, why do we have to write there was 6 days? Indeed, says Reish Lakish, Zeh bana'av. This is a source law for other areas. That what? Shekol hanichnas b'machna shchina. You are entering machna shchina. Ton perisha shisha. How beautiful is that? Hold on, v'ha'anan shivatanan. We learned the din is 7 days, not 6 days. So the Gemara explains that our Mishnah, Masnisim, follows the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, who holds the Chayish Daf Dalid on the top, Le Tumas Beisoi. What's Tumas Beisoi? Let's read inside the top Rashi and Daf Dalid, the din that we learn in Nida, the din that's really written explicitly in the Chumash, that if a man has a relation with his wife, but God forbid she becomes a nida. Either she was a nida or she becomes a nida. That's called boil nida. So normally a nida has the status of an av, and whoever has contact with an av becomes a rishon. And how does a rishon become pure? He only needs to go to the mikvah, or she needs to go to the mikvah, and that's it. And then for truma, for kachim, wait until night. But a person who has a relation with a nida, God forbid, becomes just as tamei as a nida, becomes tamei on the level of a av. Now, in order for an Av to become pure, they need to have 7 days. So since Lutumas Beis says Dr. Rashi, Shema, if the Perisha would only be for 6 days, which means 7 days prior to Yom Kippur, this Kohen Gadol would have still been at home, it could be that he's going to have a relation with his wife. Of course, he'll never have a relation with the wife while she is already in Ida, the top line in Ashi, but it can happen in acts and roinus that Vetira Dam, B'Shas Bia, she might see blood during Bia. V'nimtza, it's going to come out that he'll become Tommy for 7 days, Kemishpat Boyel Nida, and he won't be able to do the Avodah of Yom Kippur. So therefore, as the commentators explain, the fear of Tumah, according to Reish Lakish, is not the reason for Perisha. Guys, going away from Tumah is like Sur Mirah. Go away from Tumah. Reish Lakish's whole beautiful innovation of learning this from Sinai, it's not about running away from evil. It's about when you are going into even a holier place, when you're going into the Machna Shechina, when Moshe Rabbeinu is going into Shamayim, when the Kohen Gadol is going to go into the Kodesh Kachim, you have to take another step of preparation for the future. Not running away from something negative, but getting ready to enter something even holier. Once you are already getting ready, now add another day. The Iker Perisha is in order to enter Machna Shechina. But why not cover another small possibility, which is Tumas Beisai? If you wouldn't have had Sinai, then why would we be worried about such a anomaly? God forbid that a person, Ba'inus, is going to have a relation with us. We wouldn't have to worry about that. Now, what do we have over here? Gavaldik HaMachlokas Rabbi Yechanan and Reish Lakish. What's the source of Shivas Yamim? And let's word it this way. I mean, there's so many ways of looking at it, and we always quote how the Rebbe emphasized that Reish Lakish was about Tshuva, as the Gemara says. And the Rebbe celebrates the Chazal that b'makim shebali Tshuma oimid ein tzadikim gemurim even yecholim la'amoid. Why is that negeh to this machlokes? Because many ask, the Ran and other Rishonim, how can Reish Lakish b'chlal learn How can he learn the entering of the Kodesh Kachim from Moshe Rabbeinu entering Sinai? I mean, you have to admit, whatever that means, that Moshe Rabbeinu went into the heavens, I mean, that's mamish. He went into the realm of Shamayim. That has a lot more holiness than the Kohen Gadol entering into the Kodesh HaKachim. And if that were to be the case, then how can you learn every year the avoid of entering the Kodesh HaKachim from Sinai? And perhaps, in a Chanami, Rabbi Yechanan felt that you can't. But dafke, because a Yid is about Tshuva, they are about Tshuva, when a Kohen Gadol, who let's say is about Tshuva, who would enter the Kodesh Kachim, it's mamish entering Har Sinai de Shamayim. It's taka the same Madrega. Because he's on a higher level. He's on the level of Moshe and Shamayim. And therefore, Sinai will become a great teacher for the din of Prisha Shivas Yomim. Chaver Gavaldik, God willing, to be continued.